My name is Mercy Cox. I'm Josh's cousin. My research paper is titled The History and Benefits of Sourdough Bread and is about where sourdough came from, how it works, and what food products you can make out of it. My first point that I researched was the brief history of rising bread, and I found that sourdough was discovered in Egypt when Egyptians left a mixture of flour and water out, and it caught wild yeasts and began to rise. That was the first time any kind of rising bread was discovered. Before that, they just made flatbread over fires. And so after they discovered it, it spread all over the world until everybody was using it to make their bread rise, like all over the world. Everyone had sourdough. That was it. Then I was researching the different kinds of leavening, and although sourdough was the first leavening discovered, it's not the only kind of leavening. There's chemical yeast and natural yeast, and chemical yeast is when the yeast goes through a chemical reaction to produce carbon dioxide, which is what makes things rise, and natural yeast goes through a biological reaction. So chemical yeast is comprised of baking powder and baking soda, and natural yeast is comprised of sourdough and commercial yeasts, which are active dry yeast and instant yeast, and natural yeast is the kind of yeast that people use to make bread. My third point that I researched was the chemistry of sourdough. I found that there are two main things that play an important role in the chemistry of sourdough: gluten and fermentation. Gluten is so important in making bread because it is what holds the carbon dioxide in and makes bread rise. Gluten is the result of water molecules bonding with protein molecules in flour to form a network. Fermentation is an important part in making sourdough bread because it gives bread its flavor and its rise. Fermentation is when the yeast in dough processes the sugars from the flour and turns it into carbon dioxide. The fourth point I researched was the products of sourdough. After learning so much about sourdough, I was very curious to find out what kind of foods you can make with sourdough starter, which is where the yeast in sourdough bread comes from. So I found that you can bake sourdough into almost any baked goods by substituting the flour and liquid with sourdough starter. You can add it to things like pizza to add unique flavor, or cake because it adds health benefits, makes it moister than regular chocolate cake. So when you add sourdough to a recipe, it breaks down the gluten, which makes it easier for your body to digest. It breaks down the phytates in the flour, which makes it higher in vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. My favorite part while writing this research paper was doing the research and understanding more about sourdough because I was working with it every day making bread. So when I understood how it worked, I was able to fix my bread and make it better. And then my least favorite part was writing the thesis statement and the introduction and conclusion. Okay. Yeah. Are there any questions?
Explain how you did better on me than the introduction.
Because I'm very boring in my writing, and I just state what needs to be stated. That's what I think. And so that's what they're supposed to be. They're supposed to just state the facts without being interesting. Any other questions?
Did you bring us a sample of your chocolate chip cupcake?
No, I didn't.
I've been looking forward to it.
Oh, I can try to make something for Expo.
Historical question.
Mm-hmm.
Did the invention of sourdough bread spread like wildfire? Was there any trade tensions that suddenly arose?
I did not see anything about that.
Think about it, and then somebody was like, "Oh, it's pretty good, actually."
It was so it stayed in Egypt, and then it just gradually went, and it wasn't like it caused a boom. It didn't everyone's like, wait, you can make bread rise? It was really cool for the Egyptians, but I didn't read anything about how other people were shocked by it. And another cool thing is that's where the Israelites learned it, is when they were brought into captivity in Egypt. That's where they learned it. And in, I think it's Exodus, where they said that they had to have flatbread because they didn't have time for the bread to rise. That's because sourdough takes so long to rise. and they didn't have time for like the 24 hours to make the bread. So that's why they had to have flatbread and all their. They were making bread dough. They would have leftover bread dough. They would keep leftover bread dough and take a little bit of that and put it into their next batch of bread dough, which is starter, what we call starter. Mhm. Keep a bit of their old bread dough, add it to their new batch of bread, and then that's just how they did it. Mhm.
So I have a couple questions. The Egyptians discovered it.
Mhm.
Did you learn anything about how they collected it?
Collect.
Or was it just a process of always leaving it open to wild yeast?
Yeah, so it was discovered when they accidentally left their flour and water mixture out to sit, and then it's pretty easy to keep alive, just leaving it out in the open, and it'll just collect more and more.
And you had also stated that the Egyptians were not careful about their food. They often would just leave stuff out.
Yes.
Very good at fermenting things.
Uh-huh.
Whereas the other nations of the world were more careful and they didn't leave stuff out and they didn't ferment.
Yeah, so I read a quote by Herodotus about how everyone else in the world at that time, they were worried about their food spoiling. They were trying to keep everything fresh, eating it right away. But then the Egyptians, they would leave their food out and see what's going to happen to it. And that's how they discovered sourdough, because they left their food out.
So the Egyptians discovered it. Was there a different country that like made it famous? Perfected the recipes or using it?
One country that has amazing sourdough, and that's more in modern times, is France. They're like famous for their bread and their sourdough. I'm not sure if they perfected it, but they're famous for it because they do such a good job with it. But that's more in recent times, not more ancient.
So I have a really hard question. After the Passover, when the children of Israel, for the rest of their lives, including today, they were required to memorialize the Passover and the escape from Egypt. And one of the parts of their, what do you call it, religious memorialization is they had to clean their house from every bit of yeast. And so as I'm listening, I've read that all these years, I've always thought of little packets of yeast. And I'm thinking, well, that's easy. You go in the cupboard, you take it out, throw it away, and then you're yeast free. But apparently, yeast is in every crack and corner. So we're talking about
Sprinkling.
How do you cock sprinkles? Top to bottom, you get everything complete. Is that right?
Well, yeast is also in the air, so to get everything clean, you have to like wash every surface because it's on every surface. But I'm not sure if you'd be able to completely get rid of yeast in an area. I'm not sure about that because when you have sourdough starter, it's catching the yeast from the air. So.
Wouldn't they just throw away their sourdough?
Yeah, well, they might. That's probably what they did. Yeah, they probably just threw it out as well.
Would that be a beneficial thing for the dough starter to get rid of the old? Does it eventually collect other bacteria and have problems? Is it healthy to restart it?
Sometimes it is possible for your for your sourdough if you don't feed it, then it'll get hungry and then it'll become weak, and then other bad bacteria will be easily invaded by bad bacteria. So that could have been a way of keeping it healthy because what? Okay, because you don't want to have. Sometimes when you have a sourdough out for a long time, it could start growing bad bacteria. So that could have been a way to keep it healthy.
Aren't you aware of certain sourdoughs that are really old, though?
Old. Yeah, so to have an old sourdough starter, you just got to keep up with it without letting it grow bad bacteria. But part of my research was, does old sourdough starter taste better? Is it like better for you? And scientists did lots of experiments, and they didn't find any difference in the flavor of old sourdough versus new sourdough.
But isn't it true that different areas of the world have different flavors?
Yes, they have different yeasts and bacterias in different areas of the world, so there will be different flavors, but that's not with the age of it. It's with the different region.
So, if we have different yeast in the air in Japan than we have in China.
So one example is San Francisco is really famous for its sourdough starter because it's I think they said it was because of the moist. It was like very humid, and it grew a certain kind of yeast and bacteria that made a very sour and like tangy sourdough starter. So they'll have different. So my sourdough starter tastes different than.
Do you have a name for yours?
I do, but I don't call it that. I'm bad at names. My sourdough starter is named Rilla. So Rilla, Rilla. It's because I read a book called Rilla of Ingleside, and I like the name. But
No, I was gonna say I read that.
yeah, I like that book.
So, do you know what the oldest sourdough starter in the world is? Like, if someone's been keeping it up, do you know?
I don't know the oldest, but I think in England, someone has a sourdough library, and he's been collecting sourdough starters from all over the world, really old stuff. And you'll go into this room, and there's like these refrigerated windows with all these sourdough starters from all over the world, different ages. And I know he's got like really old stuff, but I don't know the oldest.
What are there 70-year-old ones? Or
Oh yeah,
100-year-old?
yeah. There's like really old. I'm not sure about 1,000. Actually, they went to Egypt and they like scraped off some sourdough from an old pot and they activated it. So I know there's a really old one, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
I looked it up. This is what you're talking about, and it's 4,500 years old.
Yeah. So that's probably the oldest.
I guarantee you an Israelite probably ate bread from that.
Yeah, they have sourdough starters from Egypt back then. So, Israelite.
I don't know if they were in Egypt at that time still.
Yeah. They probably.
The kind of wheat. Does the kind of wheat affect how the sourdough behaves? If you are using one kind and it's used to that, and you switch to a kind with more or less gluten or something, what will happen?
So I've only tried it with whole wheat flour, like regular wheat that we have nowadays, and white flour. And I've heard that it's good for your sourdough starter. It keeps it awake to be switching back and forth between whole wheat and white flour. Now, some people, they keep it separate. They have a whole wheat flour sourdough and they have a white flour sourdough. But I've switched mine back and forth several times, and it likes it. It gets really bubbly. And with flours, when the more gluten it has, the more it will rise because it holds the air in better. So that's how it reacts with different flours. Like white flour, it will rise so much better and be so much fluffier than with whole wheat flour. And the Egyptians were using a ancient grain. I think it's spelt. They have all these different ancient grains, and that had a lot less gluten than white flour, and so it was a lot more dense than our sourdough starter. So.
I have a question about gluten. So, I don't know much about what you're talking about, so I'm confused. I hear a lot about gluten-free bread. Then I'm hearing about the value of.
Your question was about how they make gluten-free bread rise, and I'm not sure about all bread, but when I was looking to see if I could make gluten-free sourdough bread, like with gluten-free flours, a lot of recipes called for, I think it was psyllium husks. Maybe it was one of those. No, that's a different thing. They added something to make it kind of like to imitate gluten, to hold in the air bubbles. But gluten-free bread, because it doesn't have gluten, it's very dense. So it's a very dense bread, and that's why I'm glad I'm not gluten-free.
Keep sharing your secret with Grandma because
The answer.
gluten bread is better than hers.
That was wrong last year.
Just kidding.
I think what the live stream missed was whether or not gluten-free people can eat sourdough bread.
Okay.
Is sourdough bread gluten-free or not?
So the answer is if you have a gluten allergy, just like a slight what's it called? You just intolerance. Usually you can eat sourdough bread because it's lower gluten, but if you can't have any gluten, you can't have sourdough bread because it still has a small amount of gluten. That's all. Good. Yeah, she has really good. Oh, is that the cornbread I sent her? Oh, that was really good.
But it's like dessert.
We just made on Sunday. I just made what was it? Coffee cake, sourdough coffee cake, and it was mainly sourdough starter instead of any flour, and it was so good. It had such a sour flavor. It was like, no, it was like part whole wheat, like probably quarter whole wheat, but it was mainly white flour. Yeah.
How did you find out about sourdough?
So we have a friend, and she had sourdough starter, and Mom told me to get it and figure it out. And then it was actually, I didn't really want to. I wasn't really interested in it. And then Mom was like, I want you to do an expo project on sourdough. And so I started figuring out how to do it, and then I really liked it, and I love sourdough bread. I love bread. I've always loved bread, so then making a special kind of bread was really fun. So.
And we also noticed we don't get fat.
Yeah, we don't. It's harder to gain weight when you eat sourdough.
Do you have any ideas of doing sort of a sourdough bakery or something?
I have thought about that. I think it was I made around Christmas time. We were going to bring lots of sourdough bread to our grandparents' house, and it was a lot of work to keep up with everything because it's yeah, and then you have to make a lot. And like with yeast, everything is standardized. With sourdough, it's not. Based on the temperature and everything, it could take different amounts of time. So it would be a lot of work to do a sourdough bakery, but it's something I'm kind of interested in. Like I think it would be really fun.
So sourdough bread would cost like 10 times more.
It costs a lot, yeah. Now, I have seen bakeries and they have a process of doing it, and they'll make the price go down because they know how to do it, and the timing of everything. But it would take a bit of time to figure out how to get everything. Well, what?
Sourdough that they sell in the store.
There's in cheap stores they will say sourdough bread, but they'll take something called sourdough flavoring. Forget what it's called. They'll dry sourdough starter, grind it up, and add sourdough powder to the bread. Then they'll add yeast, and it's sourdough because it's sourdough, but it's not actually. But it has yeast, so it's cheating. But so a lot of cheap sourdough bread won't actually be real sourdough. So it'll taste slightly different. So you could usually tell.
All right, well, any other questions? We have 2 more minutes to match.
Oh!
Can you make sourdough with any grain that doesn't require gluten? For instance, could you use starchy grains like corn or rice?
Some people have done that. It makes very dense bread. You can do it, it's just a lot different. You'd have to figure out all these different things because it's corn and rice are so different than wheat. So you could do it, but it'd be very hard.
Explaining that they need to come up with something to hold and cut on the backside, like a gel or like a psyllium husk.
Not psyllium husk. That was the wrong word. Yeah. If you want more, if you don't want like a dense bread, it wouldn't rise like normal bread. But if you wanted it to have air in it, then you'd add something else because it needs.
Grandma was watching and she asked me to ask you, could you just summarize what the health benefits of sourdough bread are?
Okay, so some of them. Okay, so it breaks down the gluten, so it's easier for your body to digest. It breaks down the phytates in flour, and phytates they're sometimes called anti-nutrients, and they bind the vitamins and minerals and antioxidants. So when the sourdough breaks it down, then the bread is higher in those things. Those are the main health benefits. And some people say it's easier for your blood sugar levels. There are reasons. There's like something in the sourdough starter that helps your body with the blood sugar levels. So those are the main health benefits.